to go.
Thank you so much, Katerina. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to join you here today for our session on gender transformative programming to end child marriage. I'm thrilled to co-host this session together with my colleague from UNFPA, Jose Roberto Luna. And we have an absolutely fabulous lineup of speakers who are going to be sharing their experiences from countries as well as from the global perspective. While I'm doing that, I want to invite you to put into the chat one word that you think describes gender transformative programming. Just one, just to get us warmed up and to kind of see the mood in the room. Critical, change, power, misunderstood, equality, redistribution, progress, structures, positive, intersectional. Well, we're using very powerful words to describe a powerful term that is absolutely very misunderstood, not just amongst those who care about it, but those who don't. So during this session, I want to really challenge all of us to reimagine a world where every girl does go to school, where she is able to complete her education and transition to work should she choose to, where she's free to make those choices and has the opportunities in front of her that we heard are so crucial to ending child marriage. And to get there, that the programs we're delivering are girl-focused and girl-centered. They listen exactly to what girls are telling us, that we're able to rapidly adapt. And through small steps, we're able to gather those kinds of finances that we need for large-scale change and to reach the girls in the poorest and most remote areas, where our parenting programs don't only have women in them, where it's men and boys who are calling for change and more budgets for girls' education and safety, where violence is a thing of the past. And that is gender transformative programming, where we start tackling the underlying drivers of child marriage and don't reinforce restrictive gender norms, but actually work towards that transformative vision that we all hold so dear in child prevention programming. However, it is a complex term, it is misunderstood, and it can often be used as an empty phrase to make us look good without any substantive programming behind it. So it is with some trepidation that both UNFPA and UNICEF have embarked in our strategic plans to deliver gender transformative programming across a range of sectors. For UNICEF, in our Gender Action Plan, we've called on all partners to join us in a journey of gender transformative program, most particularly in our child protection work. And we've described what we think it is, and we've also outlined a series of benchmarks and targets in this area. At the same time, we know that there's a huge risk in doing so, because if we don't have the right kinds of partnerships, the right kinds of funding, and very strict measures for accountability, it will continue to be business as usual. So let's ask our panelists here today to start telling us a little bit more about how we don't do business as usual. I just want to check with Jose Roberto Luna. Was there anything you wanted to add at this stage to welcome our panel?
Thank you, Lauren. Just to say that, these words that we have, gotten in the chat box are really talking about gender transformation, power, structures, what we can change, in the formal, but in the informal, how we can address the drivers, the poverty, right? And I think the conversation is really, reviewing this term after more than 20 years, but still remains, valid and, an urgent need for programming. So welcome everyone, and over to you, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Jose Roberto. Okay, our very first panelist today, and I'm so pleased that she could join us with such a busy schedule, is Divya Suryakumar. And she is the Associate Director of Viva Girls Initiative at Madre, a feminist fund and international women's rights organization. And we were very deliberate about inviting Divya because a key part of gender transformative programming is working with women and girls, grassroots movements, and feminist founders, just like Divya. So Divya, I want you to tell me about what you think is your most powerful example of gender transformative programming, and why is it so essential to work with women and girls in this work?
Absolutely. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good middle of the night.
I think after looking at what came through in the chat, it's really clear that everybody really understands the power dynamics at play when we talk about gender transformative approaches. And what we have seen through our work at Madre is that it is a catalyst. Supporting girl-led and feminist networks is a catalyst that transforms power dynamics. And without support to girl-led and feminist networks as a pillar of gender transformative programming, while change happens, it happens at a different pace. And so when we think about, the chat of course blew up with this word power, we recognize that it's a negotiation of power. Gender transformative programming is a negotiation of power and resources, especially financial resources, who controls them and how are a key facet of challenging power dynamics. And so I think I want to share an example, but before I want to give a little bit more context about who Madre is. So as Lauren said, we are an international feminist fund and women's rights organization. And our funding strategy is that we fund what we call 5 priority populations through our grant making. So the first is Afro-descendant girls, girls with disabilities, Indigenous girls, refugee IDP girls, and LGBTQI youth. And so through Viva Girls specifically, we are focused on directing grant making resources directly to those girls to uplift their leadership and support their visions for change. So the example I wanted to share is that of our 2020 grant making docket, where 73% of our funds went directly to young feminist first-time grant seekers from those populations that I mentioned. And so I want to pause for a minute just to let you think about the type of power dynamics that these young women must face, not only in their communities, but also in the world. And so we recognize that they face what we call a triple disadvantage. First, they are born into a marginalized community, they are born female, and they are young. So their voices are usually the first to be excluded in spaces where decisions are being made about them and their lives. So as we were collecting reporting from our partners, it became very clear that everybody in diverse and deeply contextual forms had acquired a certain legitimacy as well as more power from being the direct recipient and in charge of financial resources. So we heard stories from a council of elders in an Indigenous community consulting with young Indigenous feminists to young women negotiating with government bodies. So we immediately saw this type of fast and lasting power that is built from directly resourcing the work of girls and young feminists. So I think what it comes down to is that those grants are a real life bargaining chip that allow young women to push where they want to push, pull back where they want to pull back, and drive the shifts that they know that need to happen in order to combat all sorts of negative outcomes, including, but not only limited to, child marriage. And so I want to say, I think for us, the bold action was actually on our part, because these are things that young women have been doing. And so we had to reimagine our grant making process from start to finish in order to make it accessible to young feminists from these communities. And I think as we began to reimagine the process, we also began to uncover some of the roots of structural oppression that just exist inherently in how we distribute grants. So we went through this process of thinking, why do we have certain requirements? How do they exist? And how can we make sure we're not inadvertently perpetuating the power dynamics that we are trying to combat with these resources? And so I think I want to give one quick example. I know we are on, the world right now is in a state of crisis. And I think this question about why we need gender transformative approaches is also just simply that we don't have any more time to waste. From the pandemic to the climate crisis to the multiple economic crises unfolding across the world. It's just, I think our timeline has sped up in ways that it has never been pushed before. And so I wanted to share, it was really hard for me to choose one example, so I'm going to try my best to give a few quick ones. But in early August, when the Taliban began sweeping through province in Afghanistan, we heard from a collective of young feminists on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border who had mobilized quickly to support Afghan refugees flowing into Pakistan. And this group, who is a small collective of young feminists, requested an emergency grant from us to begin distributing food and water supplies to people as they crossed. So after humanitarian organizations took over the role of providing food and water supplies for refugees, this group of young feminists did a need assessment in the camp and realized that there was a high need for awareness on sexual and reproductive rights, given the precariousness of the camps, which they are now working to deliver. And the roots of this group are actually not that old. They formed in 2019 with the realization that young women and gender non-conforming folks were left out of political processes due to a lack of information. So they ran information and what they call support campaigns targeting women and gender non-conforming people. And we're actually, through the process, able to successfully register 4,000 people for the documentation required to vote in Pakistan. And so since then, they've been working with government bodies and officials to get information about COVID-19. And I think what that example represents to me is what happens with one small grant to a group of young feminists and how it just has this like ripple effect. And when we trust the leadership of girls and their lived experiences, I think I think in our sector, there's a lot of conversation about risks, but I think that's the role of us to like work with those young feminists to help them through any sort of risks, and also just trust their lead in these times of crisis, because I think they understand nuance, they are nimble, and they are able to act as and when the moment calls.
Thank you so much, Divya, for that amazing examples and for really highlighting that resourcing women and girls movements has that ripple effect and really starts contributing to that change that we want to see. And that from our side, we're going to need to invest in trust building and risk management if we truly want to do what we say we want to do, which is putting girls first. I'm going to turn next to Alana Kalantugia, who is the founder and the principal consultant at Collective Impact, a wonderful organization, if you haven't encountered them yet, founded on gender transformative thinking and principles. Alana, you are a technical partner of the Global Programme, and you've been working with select countries to roll out the Gender Transformative Accelerator. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the accelerator is and what you've been observing and learning in the rollout?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you all today. And yeah, gender transformative approaches has become a buzzword, which is both good and bad. It's good because it's a term that's garnering excitement and it's something that people want to be a part of. But, you know, somebody already mentioned in the chat, it's a term that's misunderstood. And some people use the term, but they aren't actually doing gender transformative work. Just because a program addresses gender doesn't necessarily mean it's doing gender transformative work. And gender transformative approaches are all about shifting power and resources. And to do that, it's essential to address the structural causes that underlie the power imbalances between men, women, and non-binary people, and the unequal access they have to resources and opportunities. So with that in mind, we designed the Gender Transformative Accelerator, the GTA, to create an opportunity for practitioners to engage and reflect. And it's about facilitating a process of critical reflection where country offices and their partners come together to identify opportunities and concrete actions to move the needle forward. So the GTA involves three-hour sessions spread out over the course of a week. So it's about 9 hours of workshopping in total. And the first day is all about the gender equity continuum. So thinking about what it means to be gender blind, gender responsive, gender aware, and gender transformative. And we start off by looking at each of the 6 components of the theory of change for the Global Programme to End Child Marriage. So that includes gender norms, girls' skills, agency, and empowerment, engaging men and boys, mobilizing communities and social networks, adolescent girl responsive systems, and strong institutional partnerships. And then for each of those 6 components, we talk about what it means to be gender blind compared to gender responsive, what specific actions can be taken to move towards the right end of the continuum, towards gender transformative, and what the key elements are necessary to incorporate to really move all the way to the right of the spectrum to become gender transformative. And then we set up an anonymous poll and ask participants to rank where they think their programs currently fall for each of those 6 components. And then a lot of really rich discussion comes out of that, especially when there's sometimes quite different opinions. Somebody might think, oh yeah, we're gender transformative. And then somebody else will say, well, actually, I don't think we're quite there. And so that process of reflection is really useful. And then on day 2, we use the socio-ecological model as our organizing framework. So we select a couple of priority areas to focus on, and sometimes those priorities are identified in advance before the workshop even starts on the pre-call, and other times they are chosen based on the rankings from day 1. So for instance, let's say engaging men and boys received the lowest ranking. That one would be gender responsive, and maybe everything else was gender aware, gender transformative. Then we might decide to choose that as one of the priority areas to focus on. And then we'd start to map out what the program is currently doing for male engagement for each of the priority areas across the different levels of the socio-ecological model. So what is the program doing to address male engagement at the individual level, at the interpersonal level, at the community, systems, and policy levels? And then as we're mapping that out, we dive deeper into what are the barriers to success and what opportunities are coming up over the course of the next year that can be leveraged for catalytic change. Day 3 is all about developing a roadmap of actions to accelerate progress and shift further towards the gender transformative end of the spectrum. So ideally, we come up with no more than 10 specific actions that can be taken over the course of the next year. And we map out who will be responsible, the timeline for next steps, and any additional support that's necessary. In the end, participants have a detailed and contextualized roadmap with concrete actions laid out for how they can implement gender transformative approaches to end child marriage. And after piloting the tool in 4 countries, in India, Mozambique, Ethiopia, and Niger, we've seen how the tool can adapt to meet people where they're at. So I think that's one of the most important things. If you're at gender responsive, there's steps you can take. It's not about jumping straight into gender transformative necessarily, but taking the steps necessary to move forward. And we've seen some positive results in terms of how countries are starting to use their roadmaps already.
Thank you so much, Alana, for walking us through what it means to be a gender accelerator country and the roadmap that comes from this exercise together with partners and internally. And I think that internal reflection is so important. I wonder how many of us listening today are starting to think to ourselves, where would I rank along the gender continuum? And thank you very much, Helen, for putting in the fantastic technical resources in the chat. We've got the global program's definition of what gender transformative is, a couple of technical briefs, as well as a copy of the gender continuum. And you can have a go at reflecting where you might stand on this. Thank you so much, Alana. I'm going to also be turning back to you later, I'm sure, during the discussion section for some examples of what is not gender transformative or gender responsive, but what is commonly thought to be when you're having conversations with our officers. So let's go now in this, we're moving swiftly through and the chat is exploding. We can start also moving. Colleagues who are listening, please feel free. Thank you for your appreciation and enthusiasm. So nice to see. We've got a great question here about, do our government partners know and care about what gender transformative programming is? Does it matter? Please do shoot your questions into the chat as we go through these panelists. Let's now turn from the global to the country. And I'm very pleased to welcome Céline Herbier, who is a UNICEF Child Protection Specialist in Ethiopia at a very, very challenging time programmatically, but nevertheless has not shied away from embracing gender transformative approaches and has been one of these GTA champion countries. So Celine, tell us a little bit about what it looks like in the programming that you're doing in Ethiopia. You've invested in several promising pathways for adolescent girl empowerment. Often those examples are included in our global reports and good practice case studies. What we want to hear from you is, how did you actually build the capacity of different service providers to deliver adolescent girl programming with a gender transformative lens? So over to you, Celine. Look forward to hearing your examples.
Thank you so much, Lauren. So maybe let me start by giving some background on why we decided to invest in the capacity of these workforces. Recently, we conducted a baseline study in Afar and Somali regions of Ethiopia, and it showed that the attitudes and the behaviors of the health workforces are not in line with what we're trying to achieve when it comes to child marriage and FGM and gender equality. And these workforces and the government of Ethiopia are our main partners to work to end child marriage and to work on social and behavior change within communities. So we realized that before we can make a change within the communities we work in, we need to address the attitudes and the behaviors of the people we work with. And as Lauren also said, we want these people to be tackling underlying drivers of child marriage. We don't want them to be reinforcing restrictive gender norms. So we partnered with Care Ethiopia to roll out the social analysis and action approach that shape their lives, but also their work. And usually Care would apply this approach within communities. But now we developed with Care this trajectory.
Maybe you should turn off your video.
It's not working?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Maybe the video. Thank you, Celine.
Okay. So we developed this trajectory with Care Ethiopia to target health, justice, and social service workforces, and to have them reevaluate their own beliefs and attitudes regarding gender equality and how their beliefs influence services that they deliver. So in this SAA trajectory, experts from different government agencies have gone through 5 steps. First, they do a few sessions of staff reflection in which they share their ideas and opinions on a few given statements. And they also discuss how gender norms in their communities influence their work. For example, we asked the justice workforce to reflect on why is it important to provide compassionate legal services to adolescent girls that have become victims of child marriage. And through these discussions, we aim to push the boundaries on social and gender norms. And the second step is a skill building component in which these workforces are trained to apply the SAA approach in their daily work, that they continue to question themselves and their attitudes and their beliefs, and that they discuss this, and that they discuss gender and power with their colleagues in the health and the justice and these social workforces. And third, we ask them to do a situation analysis. They identify barriers for adolescent girls and women, barriers that they face to access services that they themselves provide. And this is on my asking why question. So why is it so difficult to provide compassionate services for girls seeking protection? Fourth, they develop an action plan in which they are asked to integrate this lens, this gender transformative lens, or this SAA approach in their work, and to cascade it down to the lowest level. So what are the key issues they are planning to tackle? What are the entry points? Who can be their allies? Who will they work with? And what will they focus on? Will they be focused on trainings, on policies, on strategies within their workforces? And lastly, the technical experts from Care and UNICEF provide mentorship to these workforces to really integrate it and to continue to use this lens in their day-to-day work. Now this approach is being tested in 2 regions, and we are collecting lessons learned, best practices, but also we are reflecting on what we're looking forward on how we will implement this approach at scale. And the idea is for experts from the federal level government ministries to join this SAA trajectory, to really apply this lens and integrate it in their trainings, in their annual work plans and budgets and manuals, so that this can be used from federal to regional down to the ward and Kabbalah levels. And by involving these experts, we are aiming to institutionalize the approach and bring results on gender norms change at scale to shift power and resources. And I think this is what I wanted to share about the work on social analysis and action we've been doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Celine. You said 3 important things that really stay with me. One is the importance of an analysis. Both you did an analysis from the beginning to understand what the problem was, and then together with the service providers doing the situation analysis so that everybody could embrace the barriers and bottlenecks. Second, that you leaned on partners who were already far advanced in this area and used them as mentors, in this case, CARE. And indeed, they are giants when it comes to the gender continuum and are at the forefront of a lot of this programming. And third, you talked about the importance of really mentoring and supporting each other through prioritized projects. It's so hard and maybe impossible at this stage of programming to be gender transformative with everything, but to really zero in on those things that we think are going to make a difference. We already have some great questions in the chat about how involved was the education sector in this approach, and some sharing from Ghana, really relating to your experience, Celine. So thank you very much for that powerful example. We're going to move to our last and final panelist, and there's already been a lot of conversations coming in the chat from India. So I'm really, really pleased to welcome Shobhana. Hello, Shobhana, great to see you. Shobhana Boyle is the UNFPA's Gender and Human Rights Specialist in India, and she's going to talk to us about her creative experiences in taking the gender transformative approach forward. Welcome, Shobhana, it's great to see you. I want you to tell us a little bit about, in your global program experience, you've worked a lot with masculinities, and I know that this has been in the chat. There are working with men and boys is one facet of the global program's definition of what a gender transformative approach is, however, with some reservations. And there are a lot of risks here. How do we make sure that we're not diverting resources from girls, for example? So could you tell us a little bit about how you really addressed this piece? What were some of the challenges you encountered and where you're at right now? Over to you, Shobhana.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Lauren, for this opportunity. I think just to share a little bit of background of our work on addressing masculinities and engaging men and boys in India. The work began within the larger framework of the interventions about promoting gender equality, as well as addressing sexual and reproductive health and rights. In terms of how did we go about it, I think some of the reflections that have already come in, we engaged intensively with that very important stakeholder group, service providers, to address issues of masculinity in terms of the specific sectors that we engage with here in India. We also engaged pretty intensively with community members and tried to do it at a reasonable scale. Apart from this kind of engagement, we also invested in evidence building to see how masculinity as a factor impacts intimate partner violence and son preference, which is another harmful practice that we deal with in India. In terms of the focus of these interventions, I spoke about the different stakeholder groups that we engaged with, but what did we do with these stakeholder groups? In our engagements, we tried to promote facilitated reflective exercises on different concepts of power and vulnerability, on male privilege, on how power cuts across intersections, and as well as on bodily autonomy for each individual. So try to make it more and more experiential, as well as to consider the impact on those around us of the way we imbibe, we understand, we reinforce in ourselves practice masculinity. And in terms of, I think, some challenges and some learnings that I'd like to share with the group here, I think the first key learning that we've had was something that we did in the initial years, but have tried to learn from now, is not to projectize our interventions on addressing masculinity, but instead to use it as an approach. And when I say as an approach, the intention is how do we integrate the work on masculinities across sectors and at multiple levels. So right across the ecological model, from the community to the service providers to the policymakers as well. So not have standalone projectized interventions, but to have this as an approach that lasts across sectors. The second key learning that I wanted to share was about not applying it as an exclusive approach that only engages with men and boys, because addressing harmful masculinity cannot be reduced to changing individual behaviors. It needs to be leading to larger structural changes in gender relations, as well as in the status of women and girls and their agency. And in order to do that, we need to, in parallel, work with women and girls, as well as other vulnerable gender diverse groups in our community. So I think that understanding is very important, that masculinity does not equal to engaging men and boys. That is something that has been a key learning for us as we move forward with this area of work. And the third key learning, the third and last observation that I wanted to share was that this kind of work, of course, any work that challenges social norms and structures, but particularly the one that addresses harmful masculinity, creates dissonance, it creates disruption. In the immediate period, there will be individuals for who the intervention and the messages resonate deeply, and they will be willing to take that step towards shifting course from supporting, from practicing more harmful forms of masculinity towards more positive forms of masculinity. But they will also face a lot of censure, they will face a lot of policing from within the community or the institution within which they operate. And this is the point in time when it is most important to sustain those individual changes with solidarity. And therefore, as development agencies that are launching this kind of work, that are supporting this kind of work, it is important that we foster solidarity through strong partnerships, which include women's rights organizations, which include organizations that work at the intersection of power and vulnerability. In our instance, we tried to engage with Dalit rights organizations, tribal rights organizations, because they bring a certain kind of perspective of working on human rights-based work. And within that, to look at how the whole issue of masculinity also plays out. So the third point is more about, as development partners, in complex situations when one is facing backlash and when we see the tide turning, but in circumstances that are providing some resistance, it is important to stay the course. It is important to invest adequate resources, and it is important to invest for the long run, not 2-3 years, but multiple country programs perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you, Shobhana. I loved that you touched on disruption is a sign of success. And that can be quite an intimidating thought for those of us, all of us, in fact, with the UN, where our country programs are signed together with government, where in a humanitarian context, we have to focus on the humanitarian imperative and how to juggle that disruption through solidarity is such a powerful point. Thank you, Shobhana. So let's stay the course, exactly. We've got some wonderful thoughts coming in from the chat. I want to also ask now, I'm going to look at some of the questions in the chat. That's what happens when I'm trying to multitask this early in the morning. I'm going to look at some of the questions in the chat and then come back to some of our panelists for your responses. So I think one of the first things that people have touched upon is how we do need to have more partnerships with women and girls organizations. And that, calling back to Divya's point, if we do shift the resources and get it into the hands of those who need it most, it's one of the quickest ways to effect change. However, this can be disruptive. It does overturn traditional ways of funding. So I want to look back to the country participants, both Shabana and Celine. Could you tell us a little bit more about any pushback you've had with partnering with women and girls organizations, or even just some bureaucratic headaches? For example, women and girls organizations don't necessarily meet our risk control standards financially as the UN, or they may not be used to receiving money. How do you overcome that? I'm looking at both Shabana and Celine. I'm sorry, I don't have your video on screen, Celine, but let me turn to you first.
Sure. Yeah, sorry about the internet connection. It's not very stable today. But yes, we have been experiencing some pushback when wanting to work with women and girls organizations. I mean, first of all, because of some restrictive laws and regulations in Ethiopia, which have made it very difficult until very recently. So first of all, the capacities of women's organizations and girls' organizations are not up to the standards of sometimes the regulations and the risk mitigation and what you said before. We cannot sometimes enter into a partnership because they don't meet our standards. And this is one of the hurdles that we're facing. And how we are dealing with this now is to work with partners, local partners that have a bit more experience, but that have these local connections and that have these networks with women organizations, to see if they can work on this capacity building of women development armies and women development groups, which are very big here in Ethiopia. And first of all, to see, I mean, without sounding patriarchal, but to make sure that we strengthen their capacity, that they meet the standards of UNICEF and our work, and then to work through MOUs, so through memorandums of understanding, that we don't necessarily directly shift resources to them because we just cannot, because of bureaucratic reasons, but to see that if we channel through partners that are on the ground and that are trusted partners from these women organizations, and that they have these networks already. This is a bit how we've been addressing these challenges.
Thank you so much, Celine. And at the global level, I think we need to challenge our systems and see how we can actually review them and make them more accessible to these groups. So that's our homework for the headquarters bureaucrats, I think. Shabana, back to you. And while you're at it, there are some questions somebody had around how do you overcome the fact that men and boys find it really difficult, particularly boys, to act, to use positive masculinities when they're surrounded by the opposite? How do we support boys to role model? Back to you, Shabana.
So first, to address the question about the challenges with engaging with smaller grassroots organizations, I think our experience is also similar to what Celine just shared. They bring a lot of value, perhaps not recognized enough. Are women's rights organizations and feminist organizations who, by their very presence, are such an important source of support, not only for young girls, but also for women, because the experience of harmful practices is multifold at the individual level. So that is one thing. The challenges are also because I think we are right now living in programming in an environment that is increasingly restrictive. I'm speaking not only from India's experience, but across countries, where we find that the work on rights, especially the work on human rights, is challenged on many fronts. So for that very reason, I think there is problems that they may face from other actors in the community, they may face from the local administration. At an operational level, some of the challenges that we faced have been in terms of modality, in terms of the kind of budget limit that is required for engaging in and using certain kinds of modality for such partnerships. That has been a little bit of a challenge that we have faced in trying to expand our engagement, let's say, with smaller women's rights organizations. In terms of, I think I also want to add one important insight, that we've learned from some of the sister UN agencies, including UN Women, has been the UN Trust Fund, in terms of how it has enabled engagement with a lot of smaller organizations that work on rights issues, and also provided a lot of scope for both building capacities as well as opening up a line of engagement with such agencies. I think that is worth expanding, worth emulating across agencies. And very quickly, to come to the point about the question on how do we support men and boys who want to make that change in an environment that is quite resistant. I think it is important, as I said, to create those solidarities, as well as to recognize that masculinity exists in different forms. One is, yes, the more harmful hegemonic form of masculinity that is very dominant, but some kinds of masculinity are not always practiced in that manner. There may be individuals who benefit from male privilege, but practice it in a subtler manner, by being silent supporters for a norm or a practice. I think it's important to recognize the way it is practiced, to reach out to those individuals who think we can bridge that gap, bridge that divide, and always to tap into the kind of organizations that I mentioned who are present locally. We program from a large distance while we roll out such programs, but smaller grassroots organizations that work on different kinds of issues. It could be land rights, it could be livelihood issues. Because of their very presence on the ground, they are able to, I think, understand and appreciate the way rights issues cover different dimensions. And they are able to be present for such community members who are undergoing a transformation within. With the kind of exposure they're receiving. So, yes.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I have to quickly move. We've got 3 minutes left of our amazing panel. Thank you for sharing those rich insights. And I love how you talked about the practical ways through this. Divya, thank you for putting into the chat that there is a way forward, that we can work with intermediary groups. Just in 1 minute, if you could share with us your reflection from this panel and one takeaway that you would like participants to be left with.
Yeah, I think, I think what I'm taking away is that there is a need for us to think of ourselves in a broader ecosystem. It is clear that institutions exist in a certain way, and there are these dynamics that are really hard to navigate, but finding partnerships along the way, I think, is how we move quickly, because again, I think all of us are touching upon the need to radically change our approaches so that we can reach girls as needed. So I think to think about what is our ecosystem, who are the actors, and how can we move together and quickly, I understand changing bureaucratic norms is hard and it's going to take a long time, but how in this moment then can we find the partnerships that move the agenda that we are all focused on as quickly as possible? So I think that's really, I appreciate the space because there's such a diversity of voices, and having the opportunity to really bring our great minds together to figure out how we do this well.
Thank you, Divya. I love that, the interconnectedness and being part of a much broader ecosystem. Alana, a final word from you. What would you like participants to take away today?
I think when we're talking about gender, to make sure that we include the men and boys just as much, because there's still so much association with women and girls, and that definitely we do want to be the starting point. But I think the more we can make the case for how gender harms men too, and the harmful masculinities, then that will be something that really helps with their buy-in and involvement, and then really getting to creating the enabling environment. So working with men and boys, working with girls and women, but then working much more at that systems and enabling environment level to create the circumstances that will really allow people to thrive as they're trying out these, non-traditional gender identities.
Thank you, Alana, because indeed feminism is for everyone. Josie Roberto, what a perfect closing for you. Let me turn to you for our formal closing and last words. And thank you for being my co-host.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the panelists and the great discussion on the chat box. I think I'm not going to really go through because, it's so rich, but I have to say that, when we are talking about gender transformation or gender transformative approaches, we are really talking about power and redistribution of resources. And, where there is power, there is resistance, and we have to be, aware, as Shobna was saying, that, there are counter movements trying to prevent the world to really turn into more, a more equal or gender equal world. And we have to tackle, the different power dimensions. Are we ready to tackle racism, ableism, sexism, adultism, all the different power dimensions? How we can, Jackie was saying, how we can really make sure that the systems, the economic systems are equitable for everyone. Is in accessing, for example, resources through flexible streams, but also how we can really make sure that our contribution, for example, of a global program is really ready to promote, pathways of change to really change not only the informal norms, but also the structures, how the services are there to really, invest public resources in favor of adolescent girls, bodily autonomy, decision-making, and the critical role of men and boys, because it's not enough just to be engaging them. It's really transforming, as Shobna was saying, an approach to really address all the power dimensions and also challenging the power, not only with the partners or with the stakeholders, but also internally challenging our gender stereotyping, relations, and also, the way we work. So I think we have the tool, we have the global accelerator tool, we have, different countries who are going through, and we have to make sure that this approach, this gender transformative programming approach or approaches are really a way to really transform the reality and transform the discourse into real pathways, practical pathways that we can use for really make sure that we are moving to a more transformative way of doing the work on gender equality. Thank you so much, everyone.